Good day everyone, this is Brother Paul Mateo. Kami ang tagakwento ng mga libro ng pananampalataya. Article 15. Modern scripture scholarship has shown the New Testament was written well after the events took place. The miracle stories are like fishermen's tales, probably exaggerated and legendary. Sit down, please. While you're introduced to some of the latest scholarship, yes, you're correct, that many scholars, both Catholic and Protestant, say the books of the New Testament were written so late, perhaps even into 2nd century, that they couldn't have been written by the men whose names they bear. The scholars' conclusions are often tendentious. They are opinions drawn all too often from a bias against miracles. If something supernatural appears in Scripture, their prejudice is to assume it must have been a late interpolation, not an accurate account of what really happened. This position relies largely on the theory that the Gospels were written many years after the events they describe, so long after, in fact, that errors and legends crept into the reporting. But in the last few years, top-flight scholars have unearthed information which suggests a new understanding that the New Testament books, particularly the Gospels, were composed very early. French scholar Claude Tresmontant, for instance, posits that Matthew's Gospel may have been written in Hebrew, later translated into Greek. Within a few years of the resurrection, the late Jean Carmignac came up with early dates also, as did the late liberal Anglican scholar Bishop John A.T. Robinson, concluded in his 1976 book Redating the New Testament that all the books of the New Testament were written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred in 70 AD. The dating of New Testament books has been a roller coaster ride. A century or two ago, scholars thought many of the books had been written in the 2nd century, contradicting the ancient view that each book was written by an apostle or the disciple of an apostle within a few decades of the resurrection. As scripture scholarship advanced by fits and starts, but mainly by fits, datings were thrust backward closer to the ancient position. If Tresmontant, Carmignac, and Robinsons are right in their views, even some of the ancient writers will appear to be late daters, and the miraculous stories will seen as coming from eyewitness or from those who obtained their information from eyewitnesses. Redating the New Testament was politely, but not for the most part, enthusiastically reviewed in the scholarly journals. What could one expect? People who had staked their reputations on dating the New Testament as late as possible, even parts of it, well into the 2nd century, were displeased that someone not able to be classified as reactionary should come up with answers Augustinians would have been comfortable with. Robinson's work from an exclusively historical methodology, wrote John Carmignac in The Birth of the Synoptics. I work with a methodology which is principally philological but historical on occasion. That is Carmignac, based his studies mainly on the meaning of and history of words. A Dead Sea Scrolls translator and an expert in the Hebrew in use at the time of Christ. He reached conclusions similar to Robinson's, but he came at the problem from different angle. He translated the Synoptic Gospel backwards from Greek into Hebrew. He was astonished at what he found. I wanted to begin with the Gospel of Mark. In order to facilitate the comparison between our Greek Gospels and the Hebrew of text of Qumran, I tried for my own personal use to see what Mark would yield when translated back into the Hebrew of Qumran. I had imagined that this translation would be difficult because of considerable differences between Semitic thought and Greek thought. But I was absolutely dumbfounded to discover that this translation was, on the contrary, extremely easy. Around the middle of April 1963, after only one day of work, I was convinced that the Greek text of Mark could not have been redacted directly in Greek, and that it was in really only the Greek translation of an original Hebrew. Carmignat had planned for enormous difficulties, but they didn't arise. He discovered the Greek translator of Mark had slavishly kept to the Hebrew word order and grammar. Could this have been the result of a Semite writing in Greek? A language he didn't know too well, and on which he imposed Hebrew scriptures? Or could the awkward phrasings found in our Greek text have been nothing more than overly faithful translations, perhaps transliterations rather, would be more accurate of Semitic originals? If the second possibility were true, then we have synoptic gospels written by eyewitnesses at a very early date. Carmignat spent most of the next 25 years meticulously translating the Greek into Hebrew 68 to 79. In Greek as in English, the Benedictus as poetry seems unexceptional. There is no evidence of clever compositions. But when it is translated into Hebrew, a little marvel appears in the phrase, to show mercy to our fathers. The expression, to show mercy, is the Hebrew verb hanan, which is the root of the name Yohanan, John. In he remembers his holy covenant, he remembers is the verb zakar, which is the root of the name Zachary. In the oath which he swore to our father Abraham is found for to take an oath on the verb shaba, which is the root of the name Elishaba, Elizabeth. It is by chance, asks Carmignat. The second strophe of this poem begins by a triple allusion to the names of these three protagonists, John, Zachary, and Elizabeth. But this allusion only exists in Hebrew. The Greek or the English translation does not preserve it. Carmignat gives many other examples that he draws these conclusions about the dating of the synoptics. The latest dates that can be admitted are around 50 AD for Mark, around 55 for completed Mark, around 55 to 60 AD for Matthew, between 58 and 60 for Luke. But the earliest dates are clearly more probable. Mark around 42, completed Mark around 45 in Hebrew. Matthew around 50 in Greek. Luke a little after 50. These dates are all approximate, of course, particularly those for Mark and Matthew, and they are the results of Carmignat's mainly philological analysis. Claude Tresmontat in the Hebrew Christ, working parallel to the Carmignat but with a different methodology, comes up with these datings. Matthew early 30s, within a few years of the resurrection. Luke 40 to 60, Mark 50 to 60. Carmignat keeps to the view that Mark was composed first, while Tresmontat thinks Matthew preceded Mark. And regardless, each denies what is the majority opinion among biblical scholars that the synoptics were written late in the first century, possibly into the last decade or two. Carmignat draws a few other conclusions. He says that the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and the documents on which Luke based his Gospel were written in a Semantic language, either Aramaic or Hebrew, but he says Hebrew is more likely. What is more, the Gospel of Mark probably was written in the first Hebrew by Peter, with Mark acting as Peter's secretary. Then this Gospel was translated into Greek, possibly with changes by Mark around the year 63. This Gospel has preserved the name of the translator rather than the than that of the original author. As he wrote The Birth of the Synoptics, Carmignac suspected his scientific arguments would prove reassuring to Christians and would attract the attention and interest of non-believers. But they overturn theories presently in vogue, and therefore they will be fiercely criticized. Truly honest scholars will have to grapple with what Carmignac has come up with. Others will continue where he left off. It may be a few decades from now that the assured results of modern biblical scholarship will look different from what we have been told to accept as gospel truth. Muli, ako si Brother Paul Mateo na nagsasabing, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it shall be open to you. Thank you and God bless us all.